1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Jacobs. Welcome to the Sales Hacker Podcast. We've got an incredible episode upcoming with world-famous author Dan Pink, so I'm so glad you're listening. A couple messages that we want to share with you before we get started. The first is from our sponsors at AirCall. AirCall is a platform to make every conversation count. They empower sales and support teams to ace every call with a phone system specifically built for their favorite business tools. Now, I happen to know the company pretty well. They've been growing very, very quickly. One of the nice things about AirCall is they integrate directly with all of your customer support systems like Zendesk. It's really, really easy and seamless. They have a self-service product in addition to a product built for teams. They've been growing 5 to 6x over the last couple of years, and they're just a phenomenal company, and the customers love it. They've got over 1,000 customers, including, in fact, the actual number is over 3,000 companies worldwide. Some of the customers include SeatGeek, Uber, Birchbox, and if you're in New York, I know they have a very strong presence in New York. So take a look at AirCall. The website is aircall.io. One more thing before we get started. We've got a lot of folks listening out there and sharing some of our content on LinkedIn. And I just can't tell you how appreciative we are at the Sales Hacker Podcast of all of the folks that have been writing in. So I want to start doing a thing where we mention some of the folks that have reached out to me over LinkedIn and giving them a little bit of a shout out in appreciation for their support. 3 folks today, Lenny Fernandez, Shane Black, and Slay Huff. Slay Huff has been buying some of the books that we've been recommending on the podcast. Lenny Fernandez has sent me a lot of really nice messages, so I really appreciate it. And Shane Black really liked our episode with David Priemer. So Shane, Lenny, Slay, thanks so much for listening. If you're out there and you want to shoot me a note and you have ideas for new episodes, please let me know, because we're excited. We always want to get better. And if you have guests that you think would be interesting, send them my way. And without further ado, let's take a listen to Dan Pink. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Sales Hacker Podcast. Today is a very, very special episode. We've got probably the most celebrated person to appear yet on the podcast. But beyond that, somebody that's actually been a very big influence on my life personally. So let me first tell you about him. So Dan Pink is our guest today. He's the author of 6 provocative books, including his newest, When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing, which has spent 4 months on the New York Times bestseller list. His other books include the long-running New York Times bestseller, A Whole New Mind, and the #1 New York Times bestsellers, Drive and To Sell Is Human. His books have won multiple awards and have been translated into 37 languages. He lives in Washington, D.C., home of the Stanley Cup champion Washington Capitals, with his wife and their 3 children. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you for having me, Sam. I never would have expected anybody would have introduced me as hailing from the home of the Stanley Cup champions, but it's great.
It's a wonderful time in existence, despite all of the other bad things that are happening.
Well, I'm hoping that it clears a path for my beloved Washington Nationals to break their curse.
I think this is the year. I was exactly just thinking that. And anyway, we can talk about DC sports at length, but the only bad part of all of it was that Bryce Harper was a Las Vegas Golden Knights fan, which was a disappointment.
Well, another signal that it might be his last year here in the nation's capital.
Exactly. Max Scherzer, though, undoubtedly the Cy Young of the National League, if you ask me.
I have 2 spirit animals, Max Scherzer and James Harden.
There you go.
That's who I want to be.
Well, I'm hoping that you have a James Harden-style beard right now.
I don't. I don't know if I could even grow that. That is the kind of aspiration that's even too high for me, Sam.
Nevertheless. All right. So back to serious business here. Dan, it would be helpful. You've written so many amazing books. And just for the folks out there, I first came to know about Dan through his book, To Sell Is Human. And then his TED Talk on the Science of Motivation is one of the 10 most watched of all time with more than 20 million views. And I regularly cite it in sort of discussions about how to motivate people. So tell us how you got into writing such interesting books and where inspiration comes from, and just sort of give us a little bit about your evolution, because it's always interesting to hear where people come from.
Okay, so I came to the path of being a writer, or the kind of writer I am now. I think most people, indirect, stumbling, fits and starts kind of way. I started out my working life with a law degree and no desire to practice law. So instead, I started working in politics, which is something that I was, at the time, very keenly interested in. I worked in a number of jobs in politics, like campaigns on Capitol Hill, for a cabinet official, and for reasons, again, another set of really just kind of random half-ass reasons, I became a political speechwriter because it was something that I could do marginally better than other people who were in the office. That became what I did. And I liked it. And I was pretty good at it. And I became chief speechwriter to Vice President Al Gore in 1995. I was there in 1996. But in 1997, later in 1997, after a couple of years, it dawned on me that I didn't want to work in politics the rest of my life. In fact, I didn't want to work in politics anymore. And so what I really wanted to do was write under my own byline, write my own stuff. And this is something that I had always done on the side, something that I had done ever since I was in college, writing articles and essays and op-eds and things like that for magazines and newspapers. I always considered it kind of a hobby in a sense, something that I did that wasn't really like my job. It was just something I did because I thought it was kind of fun and interesting. But it took me into my early 30s to say, wait a second, this might be what I do. And so that's when I started. So this is now 21 years ago. And I went to work for myself. Again, not a wild, crazy decision because my wife kept her job when I quit my job. She didn't leave her job or her salary or her health insurance. And I said, no, let me just try to make it at writing my own stuff, see how it goes. And that was 21 years ago. And, what I've tried to do as much as possible is write about things that I was deeply interested in. And there are two reasons for that. First is that writing a book is really, really hard. It's a giant pain. And if you don't really love your material, it's going to be even more miserable and you're probably not going to write a good book. Second is that I've always felt like if I'm interested in something, then other people will be interested in it. That I don't think that I have extreme taste or exalted taste or specially refined taste. That if there are things in my life that I'm wondering about, whether it's, hey, what kind of skills are my kids going to need in a workforce where work is easy to be outsourced and automated? How do you really motivate people at work? Is selling a noble profession or something sleazy? How do you make better decisions about when to do things? I always felt, if I'm wondering these things, then other people are wondering it too. And so I've written these 6 books, again, really driven by my own interests and trying to figure out what makes people tick, what people actually do at work, how they can do it better. And I've always been fascinated by work as a lens because we spend over half of our waking hours sometimes at work. And so it becomes this great way to study who human beings are, why they do what they do, what are their conflicts, how do they work together, what are their aspirations, what are their hassles. And so that's what I've tried to do. I've been working for myself for 21 years. I started out working on the 3rd floor of my house. Then we moved and I was promoted to the garage behind my house. So I've never had an office that wasn't at my house.
Well, and I can actually hear the birds in the background right now.
Can you really? Yeah, there are. I mean, it's springtime here, and it's the end of springtime here in Washington as we're talking. And seriously, it's annoying. The skies are awash with chirping birds.
I find it quite pleasant, actually. It's sort of
do you? Okay, good.
A pastoral picture. So let's talk about your most recent book. It's incredibly fascinating and,
hey, thanks.
Of course, relevant for salespeople. It's called When. Tell us a little bit, more about it.
So this book is about the science of timing, and that's really the main idea of the book. As I said, I was talking about in that lengthy overview of my life and times, what generally prompts me to write books are my own questions. And again, the assumption that other people are probably dealing with things that are similar. And in this case, the question that I was asking myself out of frustration was, how can I make better decisions about when to do things? So, because in the course of a day, a week, of life, you make all kinds of when decisions. When in the day should I do this kind of work? When in the day should I do that kind of work? When should I exercise? When should I start a project? When should I stop a project? When should I make a sales call? When should I not make a sales call? And I was making the decisions in a very sloppy way. I wanted to make them in a more systematic way. And as someone who has studied behavioral science, spent a lot of time looking at the research in a number of different realms and in a number of different books, I said, I wonder if there's any research out there on this topic of when to do things. And it turned out there was a huge amount of research on this question. It was spread across many, many, many different fields. And so it took some corralling. But what I found is that while we make most of our timing decisions based on intuition and guesswork, that's the wrong way to do it. We should be making them based on this rich body of science and evidence and data. And so the book lays out the science of when to do things. How does the pattern of the day affect what we do and how we feel about it? Why do breaks matter? How do beginnings affect us? How do endings affect us? How do midpoints affect us? How do groups synchronize on time? And so the goal is to give people a taste of the science, a taste of the evidence, but then also direct them into some very simple, practical, tactical things they can do to make better decisions in their own life.
So, just jumping off into that from that starting point, the first part of the book, which I've read, talks about as you mentioned, the hidden pattern of everyday life. and that there are times when to make decisions. So walk us through that, because that was obviously extremely interesting and helps. We're doing, as I mentioned before we started recording, we're doing this podcast at 2 p.m. This is a very significant part of the day when maybe we are more inclined to perhaps dislike each other.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that it is a suboptimal time of day, but there are things that we can do about it, about which more in a moment. The idea here is that if you look at, again, and I think one of the interesting things about this particular topic is that there is a field called chronobiology, which is the study of our biological rhythms. But beyond that, this study of timing is something that's studied in different ways by many, many different disciplines. It's been studied in a whole array of life sciences and medical sciences, so anesthesiology, endocrinology, molecular biology, but it's also been studied in an array of social sciences, whether it's social psychology, economics, anthropology, linguistics. And what it tells us, at least at the unit of a day, which is a very important unit because a day is something we can't control, right? I mean, we're on a planet and that planet makes a turn every single day. And that turn, that pattern of the day has a profound effect on our mood and our performance. And I think what's interesting about it is that so many scholars in so many different fields, using so many different disciplines, keep coming to the same conclusions. And the main conclusion here, and I think in terms of your listeners, Sam, whether they're sales reps, whether they're sales VPs, whether they're sales managers, whether they're chief revenue officers, whatever, is this, that our cognitive abilities, our brain power, doesn't stay the same throughout the day. It doesn't stay static throughout the day. It changes. Okay. So your mental sharpness is not the same at different times of day. Now, at some level, we kind of sort of knew this intuitively, but at other levels, we didn't. And so for me, for instance, when I felt like, ooh, wait a second, I don't feel as sharp right now, I thought of that as, a weakness, as something peculiar, right? And it's really not. So our cognitive abilities aren't the same throughout the day. They change in predictable ways, and sometimes they change in pretty extreme ways, so that the difference between the daily high point and the daily low point can be quite large. And when we do something depends on what it is that we do. And it's possible to discern a pattern of the day and to figure out when to do certain kinds of work at the right time.
Yeah. I will paraphrase and then you can correct me and add on, but is it accurate that at the barest essence, it's that, you do sort of your high cognitive load activities in the morning, that during the afternoon, there's sort of a trough period where both, I guess, there's more negativity generally across the human race, but also specifically your ability to sort of process difficult analytical decisions is reduced. And then there's sort of a surge as you move towards the evening. And we need to be mindful of that. Is that an accurate, summary?
That's pretty accurate. Let me make a couple of refinements here because there is some nuance in this. So at the start, some of this depends on what's known. I mentioned the field of chronobiology before. Chronobiologists talk about what's people's chronotype, right? And that's basically your propensity. Do you wake up early and go to sleep early? Do you wake up late and go to sleep late? Or you're somewhere in between? And so part of the pattern of the day is determined by your chronotype. And again, it's something that is heavily innate, heavily biological. It varies sometimes significantly over age. But the gist of it is this: about 15% of us, 15% of us, are pretty strong morning people, larks. Get up early, feel energetic, super energetic in the morning. But 20% of us are owls. Get up late and actually feel super energetic and acute much, much later in the day, in the late afternoon, early evening, mid-evening, even later in the evening. And then about 2/3 of us are in the middle. I call them third birds. We're, a little bit of both. And so figuring out your chronotype, which is actually fairly easy to do, is the first step here. I mean, actually, I don't want to be opaque. We could figure out your chronotype, Sam, in 30 seconds if you wanted.
I've already decided I'm a lark.
Let's test this. Let's test your intuition. So there's a standard psychological assessment called the Munich-Chronotype Questionnaire, the MCTQ, that is a way to assess this. But there's a back of the envelope way as well. And so let's just check yours. I mean, literally, we can do it in 30 seconds. So I want you to think, Sam, about what's called a free day. A free day. A free day is a day you don't have to wake up to an alarm clock. And you're also, not massively sleep deprived and trying to catch up on sleep. So when you're left to your own devices, what time would you typically go to sleep when you have a free day? You don't have to wake up at a particular time. You don't have an alarm clock.
I would say 10:30 p.m.
10:30 p.m. And then what time would you typically wake up?
7 a.m.
7 a.m.
if I have no professional obligations.
Yeah. Okay, great. So what we're talking about here then is that what we're trying to do is figure out your midpoint of sleep. So what we have here is 10:30 to 7. So that would be, we got a half hour there. Let's figure this out here.
I can make it 6:30 to make it easier.
Let's make it 6:30 to make it easier.
8 hours.
So your midpoint of sleep would be 2:30 a.m.
Correct.
So that's what we're trying to figure out. Okay. So, and what the research shows is that if your midpoint of sleep on a free day is before 3:30, you're probably a lark. If your midpoint of sleep is after 5:30 a.m., you're probably an owl. And if it's between 5:30 and 3:30, you're probably intermediate, what I call a third bird. So you're definitely a lark. So that makes sense. So your intuitions are spot on. And here's what we know. Again, I don't want to take too much time talking about this, but a way to think about it is as follows. Even simpler way is like we have owls and we have non-owls, right? Most of us, larks, people in the middle, tend to move through the day exactly as you say, Sam, in 3 stages: a peak, a trough, a recovery. Peak early in the day, trough in the middle of the day, recovery later in the day. Owls are much, much more complicated, much more complicated. They sometimes will go through the day, recovery, trough, peak, but they will hit their peak far, far later in the day. So let's just say, and owls have it very hard because conventional work schedules are designed to crush their spirits. But let's take someone like you, for instance, or me. I'm not a lark. I'm in the middle, but larky. We tend to move through the day exactly as you say, in those 3 stages: peak, trough, recovery, peak early in the day. Early in the day, that's when we are most vigilant. And that's the key word. That's when we're most vigilant. We're able to bat away distractions. So during the peak, you're better off able to do work that you should be doing work that requires, be doing basically analytic work that requires analysis, focus, heads down, attention, eliminating distractions, writing a report, analyzing data, whatever that is. All right. So for most of us, it's early in the day. Now, for you, you might want to begin doing that, actually an hour earlier than me or 45 minutes earlier than me. We can't say when in the particular moment everybody should do it, but in general, early in the day, you're higher in vigilance. That's when you should be doing analytic work. During the trough, that comes in the early to mid-afternoon. That's a very, very dangerous time for people. There's a surge in medical errors. An incredible difference in problems in hospitals, declining hand washing in hospitals, overprescribing of antibiotics during this period, more per capita car crashes in this period, more anesthesia errors in hospitals. It's just unbelievable.
And didn't you also, there's criminal or judicial errors during these periods and more susceptible stereotypes and things like that?
You're exactly right about that. Excellent point. Jurors are more likely to resort to racial stereotypes in afternoon deliberations than they are in morning deliberations. And so that trough period is not a great time. And so that's when we're better off doing administrative work that doesn't require massive cognitive creativity or analytic power. Then there's the recovery period. Now, the recovery period is very interesting, and it's a little bit complex and it's a little bit nuanced because it's not merely about cognitive power isn't quite the right way to look at it. What's really important to think about is different forms of cognition. And here's what I mean by that. During the recovery, what you see in a lot of research is that our mood goes back up, all right? So our mood, for most of us, higher early in the day, declines in midday, and then recovers later in the day. And so during this recovery period, which again, for most people, 80% of us is late in the afternoon, early evening. We're high in mood, but as you say, our vigilance isn't as high. And that combination makes it a very powerful combo for a different kind of cognition. Not heads down, analytic, distraction-free thinking, but things that's a little bit looser. Iterating new ideas, brainstorming, coming up with non-obvious solutions, solving what social psychologists call insight problems, which don't bend necessarily to mathematical logic and rigor. And that gives us basically this overall guidance. So if 80% of us, we should be doing in general, analytic work early, administrative work in the middle, and creative, iterative insight work later in the day. Now, if you're an owl, then it's much more complicated. But the most important thing with the owl is that if you're an owl out there listening, your vigilance is highest later in the day. So you're better off doing your analytic, heads down, bat away distraction work late in the afternoon, early evening, even well into the evening.
Which sounds like a lot of engineers that I know.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what's going on. And so certainly engineers, software engineers who have some liberty over their own schedules choose to work like that. If they're more owls than larks, they tend to be higher in vigilance and focus later in the day than early in the day. Just to be clear, there's no moral judgment here. It's not like there's one is right and one is wrong. It's just that those people have different proclivities. But once you know this pattern, you can do the right work at the right time. And again, I don't want to belabor this, but we have to think about how much we don't do that, okay? We're not very intentional, deliberate in doing the right work at the right time. So we sometimes will do our administrative work. Larks will do their administrative work first thing in the morning. That's a huge waste. You should be doing your analytic work then and answering your routine emails in the middle of the day. Bosses should not be scheduling meetings about if they have an office full of larks they shouldn't be scheduling, a 9:30 a.m. meeting about, the travel voucher policy. That's an administrative task that belongs in the middle of the day. Nor should bosses be scheduling brainstorming sessions at 9:30 in the morning if they have a lot of larks, because people are going to be very vigilant then, and vigilance actually works against you in a lot of brainstorming, at least in the first stages of brainstorming. You want to be iterative. You want to be loose. You don't want to keep knocking down ideas. And so the real punchline here is that we have to be intentional about when we do things. And we're intentional in many cases about what we do. We have to-do lists. We're intentional about who we do things with. We have HR offices, but we're not intentional at all about when we do things. And it matters. It matters a lot. There's research showing that time of day, just time of day alone, explains about 20% of the variance in how people perform on the job. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it's an incredibly big deal. I have sort of two parts of the same question. So one is, thinking about our audience, salespeople, one of the things that we do a lot is we reach out to people that don't know who we are, meaning we prospect. And of course, we hold meetings where we're interacting with somebody else. Now, one way to frame it might be, well, I want to prospect when my prospects are less vigilant. So maybe I want to do a bunch of outreach around 3 or 4 p.m. because that is the time when, if I am able to get through to somebody, that they are less likely, but I may be defining vigilance in an inappropriate way.
You're on sort of the right track, although the train leads in a somewhat different direction.
I want to get on the right train.
But you're right about that. And it's actually a really, really important question because we know something else too about these kinds of things. What you're talking about here is, let's put a very fine point on in terms of sales, right? I think there's a difference in some cases between the meeting and the prospecting. And again, at a top level, prospecting is in part largely a number. Well, it really depends on what kind of sales you're in. But in some cases, it's a numbers game. And so you want to be doing it a lot, and time of day might matter marginally less. But if you're doing it and it's less of a pure numbers game, let's say you're selling, it's a more complex sale, it's more consultative, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a way to think about it. Think about it from the perspective of your prospect. When human beings, they're making a decision. And when human beings make decisions, particularly decisions like the one that we're talking about here, where someone is essentially forcing them into a decision, we come to those encounters with a default decision in our back pocket. And our default decision is usually no, right? So, nope, I'm not interested. Or, nope, Sam, I'm your boss, you can't have a raise. So our default decision is typically no. And so there is research, though, showing when people are likely to overcome the default. And it turns out that people are slightly more likely to overcome the default early in the day, and I think even more important, immediately after breaks. Early in the day and immediately after breaks. So if you want people to overcome the default, which is typically no, you might be marginally better off making the pitch early in the day and immediately after that person has had a break. Now, I just want to be clear here that, on some of this, none of the research yields a lockdown perfect strategy. So what we're talking about here in terms of, let's say, selling is that, maybe in an ordinary circumstance, you have an 11% chance of someone saying yes. And if you get the right time of day, maybe you can dial that up to a 14% chance of getting a yes. You still have an 86% chance of getting a no. The odds are still against you. However, as any salesperson will immediately understand, and people in sales understand this viscerally. I mean, they understand it's math, but they have a visceral understanding of this. I will take that move from 11% chance to a 14% chance if it's something I'm doing repeatedly, because over time, that's going to matter. And I think that's the way to look at it in this case. There are also we can talk about it if you want. There's some intriguing effects of sequence too. if it's a serial competition, SERIAL competition, that is, you're pitching, then I'm pitching, then Fred is pitching, then Maria is pitching, then Susie is pitching. Do you want to go first? Do you want to go last? And there's some that ends up being fairly complex, but there's some interesting guideposts that can help us figure out the sequence side of it.
What are those guideposts? That would be helpful.
I always think of like ad agencies and things like that. So a client says, okay, we're putting our current agency under review and we're inviting in 8 or 9 agencies to pitch the business. And again, like the example that I gave before, there are ways to turn the dial a little bit in your advantage, particularly about, when should you go first and when should you not go first? So let's see this. So again, back to the default thing. Let's say that, okay, I don't know if you want to keep on this ad agency idea here.
I like the ad agency idea. I mean, there's plenty of situations, to your point, where there's more than one vendor that's brought into a conversation and they are asked to go in sequence. So it's ad agency aren't the only one, but it's a perfectly good one.
Here's the thing. If you're not the default choice, okay, that is, you're pitching against someone who already has the account that you're seeking, going first can be helpful because, again, there's a default. Hey, the default is we'll probably stick with these people who we've gone with for years. This is particularly the case, not so much in an ad agency opening up or a client opening up a review, but in terms of the example that you're giving, which is, hey, we have this one vendor, but hey, we're willing to listen to some other pitches from other vendors. And so if you're not the incumbent, it's better to go first. If there are relatively few competitors, it's often better to go first because of what's called the primacy effect. And if there are a lot of strong competitors, it's sometimes better to go first.
This is interesting. So going first seems like a pretty good choice a lot of the time.
In many circumstances. However, there are many instances where you should not go first. So let's go back here. If you are the default choice, don't go first because people are likely to, you don't need to go first because in many ways, if you go at a different time, they're more likely just to cement and rubber stamp the default. If there are a lot of competitors, then going later can be a small advantage. Going last can be a huge advantage. And there's some really interesting research, believe it or not, in a whole range of different fields like idol competitions, like the singing show, the idol competitions in Europe, showing that the one who just happened to be slotted last in the performances had a 90% chance of going to the next round. You see something somewhat similar in wine tastings. You see something which is another kind of serial competition. You see something somewhat similar in figure skating. And the mechanism behind that, I think, is quite interesting because at the beginning of something, the judges, the evaluators, have this kind of idealized notion of perfection. It's like, oh, we're going to get a vendor and the vendor is going to be perfect. They're going to come in with an incredibly low price and it's going to be served by the smartest people in the world. And the product is going to be flawless, right? And then as they hear more and more, they're like, okay, wait a second, there's probably not a perfect vendor here. And so the early participants get punished for their lack of perfection. The same thing is happening too if you're operating in an uncertain environment. And this happens a lot. So let's say that you sometimes see it in job interviews, for instance, where there's a serial competition. So let's say that if they're very clear criteria, this doesn't matter. But let's say the buyer, the prospect, the decider, whoever she is, doesn't know precisely what she wants. They will use the first 2 or 3 or 4 or however many entrants to basically figure that out. And if you come in later, you're more likely to get it because they've already figured out what they want.
That's really interesting. In enterprise software, there's RFPs all the time, and they don't go out to each vendor at the same time sometimes. So it might be advantageous to come into the RFP process later after they've interviewed a bunch of other vendors. Now they know what they want, and now you can shine, hopefully.
You're totally right on that. There's not like there's a fail-safe, perfect way to do this. The most important thing, though, is to begin asking that question. It is to begin thinking about, okay, what is the effect of sequence? And those kinds of questions end up sharpening your strategy. And they should be, and timing and sequence should be part of your strategy. I mean, you have to have a good offering at a reasonable price. That's obviously essential. It's table stakes. But you might be able to derive a little bit more of an edge if you really carefully, in a strategic way, scrutinize the timing and the sequence. Again, it's not going to give you a lock. But what it is going to do is it might dial the probability a few more points in your favor. And as I've said before, and as salespeople know intuitively, if you up your odds and do something a lot, it's going to pay off.
Well, and again, you're right. It's about systematic repeatability, and then those percentages can make a big impact. Well, I want to move, if you have time, a few more minutes. I wanted to move to your penultimate book, which was the book Drive, which is all about motivation. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is because so many of my peers are managing large teams of sales executives. And at any level, managing is about tapping into the motivation of people that are working for you. And I think, you've made a lot of really interesting points over the years. And I read your Harvard Business Review article about the misuse of money as the primary motivating mechanism, even in the sales world. So would love, some of the insights about how people should think about tapping into motivation and what sort of levers might be effective.
Yeah. And once again, there's, as with all these things that are based on research, there is a degree of nuance in all of this. And at some level, when we talk about money, that's a little bit of a head fake, because what's driving a lot of the behavior and what the research is telling us is that it's not necessarily about money is important. We'll talk about that, but it's not so much money driving things. It's something else. And here's what we know. There's a certain kind of reward that we use in organizations. This is sort of at the juncture of a book called To Sell is Human and a book that I wrote called Drive, about the science of motivation. What we know from 50 years of behavioral science is that there's a certain kind of reward we use in organizations. We use lots of rewards in organizations. Some of them are monetary, some of them are promotion, some of them are recognition, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but there's a certain kind of reward that we use in organizations that psychologists call a controlling contingent reward. I like to call that something simpler. I like to call it an if-then reward. If you do this, then you get that. If you do this, then you get that. Here's what 50 years of science tells us about if-then rewards. They're extremely effective for simple tasks with short time horizons. They work really, really well. Okay. Why is that? And this is really important because we love rewards. They get our attention. They get us to focus. We lock in. And so that very narrow focus is extremely effective if you know exactly what you need to do and you can see the finish line. So if then rewards are effective for simple tasks with short time horizons. If then rewards, though, 50 years of science tells us, are far less effective for more complex creative work with longer time horizons. Why is that? It's because we love rewards so much that they get us to focus narrowly. And so if you're doing something that requires complexity or creativity, a narrow focus actually doesn't work to your advantage. It can actually work to your disadvantage. You often want a more expansive focus. What's more, that narrow focus doesn't always get you to the finish line if it is far, far away and around several turns. And so what we should be doing in organizations, whether it's a sales function or anything else, is that we should be using these if-then rewards where they work and using something else where they don't work very well. We should be using if-then rewards for simple tasks with short time horizons. We should be trying an alternative for complex tasks with longer time horizons. Now, let's go back to sales. One of the things, and this is where we're sort of bridging these two books, one of the things happening in sales, as you know, Sam, as many of your listeners know, is that sales has moved to become far less routine and transactional, because any kind of sales function that is like super simple and transactional, that's going to end up getting automated. That's going to get done with self-service. And so the sales tasks that remain are going to be the ones with higher degrees of complexity, longer time horizons, and so forth. What we have to do is we have to be nuanced in the way we deal with compensation for salespeople. If it's all based on commission or heavily based on commission, that's going to be effective if the sale is relatively simple and the time horizons of the sale are relatively short. If it's more complex and a longer time horizon, it might not work very well. If it involves collaboration, it might not work very well. And so so we have to be much more nuanced in how we deal with this. I don't think the science tells us we should be against variable comp of any kind. I don't think it tells us that. I think what it tells us is that we have to be very careful about that. And in my view of sales, which is articulated in this book, To Sell is Human, is that sales has become much more complex, much more professionalized, much more cognitively demanding than simply call, try to get a yes, 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 call, try to get a yes. I think that in many ways, business to business sales today is essentially management consulting. And, we don't put management consultants on the same kind of compensation scheme that we put door-to-door brush salesmen.
Is it an alternative compensation scheme, or is it really just an alternative reward structure? And in that alternative reward structure, is it sort of psychological rewards like?
It's a great question. And I think it's both. And I think we have to, in some ways, disentangle these two things. Let's talk about the pure compensation side. I think there's not going to be a perfect solution for every organization. I don't think there's an off-the-shelf solution for all of this. I think it's going to depend on the people you have. It's going to depend on your industry. It's going to depend on a lot of variables. I do think that there are a common set of design principles, though, especially for more complex sales. One of them is to hire great people. Okay. There is a notion in sales, our compensation scheme is so well oiled that we can put anybody into it and they're going to respond as we predict that they will respond. And that is not true. So hire great people. I think that there is, even in sales, especially in complex sales, which again, to me is becoming management consulting, there should be a healthy base salary. Then there should be some variable comp, but the variable comp should be based on a set of very simple, hard to game metrics. And I mean, literally just like 3 or 4 simple, hard to game metrics, because as everybody on this program, every listener knows, salespeople are expert at gaming any kind of compensation system. And one of the problems that organizations have is that their compensation systems, in order to avoid gaming, become complex. And all that does is trigger more complex behavior on the part of the sales force. And to the organization, it exacts a cost, because the more complex the compensation system is, the more cumbersome and expensive an administrative apparatus you have to monitor it, to enforce it, to litigate disputes within it. And so hire great people, pay them a healthy base salary, and have some variable comp based on some very simple, direct metrics that matter. I think that's the general set of design principles that are best. Again, just I want to be clear, for more complex, consultative, management consultant-like sales. If you're going door to door selling pots and pans, pay people a commission on every pot and pan they sell.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. There's a whole can of worms that this topic may ultimately open up, because I follow this stuff very, very closely. You may not follow as closely, but so, if you're a mid-market account executive, if you're selling something that's a $20,000 to $50,000 solution, and even beyond, most people's comp is 50-50 base and, commission. And many, many firms, many companies are really coming in saying, well, we're going to come in with a very low base, a base that some folks can't even live on. And then but it's the OT, it's the on-target earnings. It's the ability to earn this number that I put in the offer letter, which may or may not be realistic. It's all based on whether or not the demand is really there for the product. And so now the other side of that is that salespeople do tend to be the highest paid people in the company. And so there's this whole tangled web that has to be untangled where, maybe what we're saying is that we normalize sales compensation back to compensation that looks like every other department, where 3/4 of it is base salary and there's a bonus component, but it's not this wild roller coaster that is the life of the salesperson right now.
I think that's, again, depending on the industry and the kind of sale that it is, I think that's inevitably where things are going to go. I think that in many ways, sales compensation is a legacy of the simplicity of many kinds of sales transactions, pre-internet, pre-automation, pre-self-service, where you needed somebody to actually hit the street and take the order. When sales becomes more complex, I think you need, in general, a different compensation strategy. I think the most important thing, though, again, I don't want to be here peddling simple solutions here. I think the most important thing, though, which is exactly what you're hinting at, is to challenge the orthodoxy. Challenge the orthodoxy that the only way to motivate salespeople is through low base salaries, fear of not being able to feed their family, and dangling out super high commissions.
It makes a lot of sense. Dan, we're essentially out of time. I want to leave a few moments now to see if we can pay it forward. So we obviously, first of all, just so that everybody knows and that we do the appropriate level of publicity, the new book is called When the Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. I would imagine it's available where all books are sold, including
yes, indeed,
Jeff Bezos' company and anywhere else.
You can buy it on Amazon.com, BN.com, Indie.com. You can buy it at your favorite bricks and mortar bookstore, including your local independent bookseller.
All of them. The other books are called Drive and To Sell Is Human. And then I think maybe the longest running one is called A Whole New Mind. You also have a website, danpink.com, where I think you have a newsletter, if I'm not mistaken, and people can sign up there. Wonderful. And so then the last thing I would ask of you is, you are one of the leading business writers. I always say, in the universe. We don't know who else is out there on different planets, but certainly what other great books have you read? Who are the authors or the thinkers that you are influenced by, so that we can sort of follow the journey?
Oh, there's just so many great books and so many great writers out there. It's in many ways an embarrassment of riches. So if you think about, I think that someone like Susan Cain, who wrote a book called Quiet about the power of introverts, could be very germane to a sales audience, because there's some interesting research showing that being a strong extrovert is not the best way to be persuasive in a sales setting, that introverts and ambiverts can have some advantages as well. So I think that Susan Cain would be good on that. I think that someone like Whitney Johnson, who has written a book about how to build a great team, who was a former Wall Street analyst and venture capitalist, could have some very, 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 very interesting things to say. There are Daniel Coyle has a great book this year about teams and how teams cohere and how teams operate. There is a fascinating book by Jeremy Hyman's and Henry Timms that just came out called New Power, about how movements build in this remade landscape. I still am a fan of, and I use the terminology all the time, of Blue Ocean, the Blue Ocean folks, Chan Kim and Renee Mauborn. So there's just a lot of really, really, really great stuff out there.
Well, that was an exceptional listen. I actually typed it all down because I want to make sure that I self-edify. Dan, thanks so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. We said where we can find your books, and thanks for contributing. I think we got a lot out of it.
Thanks, Sam, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Go Caps. Hello, everybody. That was Dan Pink, world famous author, multi-million TED Talk viewing getter. And this is Sam's Corner. Obviously, we're incredibly excited and honored to have Dan on the show. He has written so many interesting books and made so many useful and interesting insights about the world. In addition to the comments that he made about his new book, When, which talks about the science of figuring out when to do things, not just how to do them or to whom to do them, has also talked a lot about motivation. And one of the things that I often reference in conversations with new managers and people that I work with is this TED Talk, which has gotten over 20 million views. So definitely go take a look at it. In that talk, he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose, the things that motivate people. Autonomy, the opportunity to act independently. Mastery, the opportunity to become excellent at something and really develop a skill. And purpose, understanding the context and the vision for why what you're doing contributes to a broader organization. I think about that a lot. And again, purpose for me comes down to context and communicating back to the organization. Here's why you are doing what you are doing, and here's how it relates to our broader goal. And I think if we can keep that in mind, we can keep all of the people in the organization with whom we're working, we can keep all of them engaged. So this has been Sam's Corner. Thanks to Dan Pink for being a special guest. We look forward to more special guests in the future, and I thank you for listening. And until then, I'll see you next time. To check out the show notes, see upcoming guests, and play more episodes from our incredible lineup of sales leaders, visit saleshacker.com/podcast. You can also find the Sales Hacking Podcast on iTunes or Google Play. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with your peers on LinkedIn, Twitter, or elsewhere. Special thanks again to this month's sponsors at AirCall. See more at aircall.io. If you want to get in touch with me, find me on Twitter at Sam F. Jacobs or on LinkedIn at linkedin.com//Sam F. Jacobs. I'll see you next time.